Use client, use server, use workflow, use step, use convex, use Cloudflare, use Vercel. What's going on with all of these directives? Why is everyone freaking out? Well, as usual, it's our favorite stirrer of drama, Vercel. They just announced the Workflows SDK, and everyone is getting upset because of this particular slide and what it means. Directives are here to stay, it seems. If you're not familiar with directives, it's a string that you put inside of your JavaScript code that is used to indicate specific behaviors. These started with the classic use strict, which was a way to try and change some behaviors in JavaScript to deprecate some not so great things and let you as a developer opt into the new behaviors. It hasn't been used very much since then. Vercel's kind of commandeered this alongside the React team in order to sneak behaviors into the framework. The big case for this is client and server components, where you're dictating what code runs where. Use server is a way to say this function runs on the server, and when you call it on the client, it's effectively an API call to the server. And use client says this code and the code in this file should be bundled up and sent to the client so that it can run there as well. So what are use workflow and use step? These are attempts to make more durable executions for your JavaScript code, which is a very exciting thing. I can't wait to tell you more about it, but first we have to use sponsor. I have an incredibly unfair advantage as the CEO of my startup, the ability to hire. Most companies don't have access to thousands of engineers ready to go to work on whatever time frame and whatever scale you need for your projects. The only way to plug that gap that I know of is today's sponsor, G2I. These guys get hiring. I wish they existed when I was hiring at Twitch. They would have made my life so much easier. They have a network of over 8,000 experienced engineers working at real companies with experience all over the industry that are ready to go and work for you. Their engineers are already up to date on the latest with AI tech and are ready to work in pretty much any stack you can imagine. Their web interface for finding engineers is incredible too. You can just select the technologies that you want to work with and get a list of people that make sense for that. You also can write your own interview questions that will be sent to the candidates, who will then film a video response that you can click through in their UI to figure out who you think's the best fit. From interview to first PR merged, their goal is to make it happen in a week, which is crazy if you've ever had to hire before. That usually takes months to get done. And if you think this is just for like small companies or crappy one-off engineers, don't. There are big companies using them, from Webflow to 1Password to even Meta. Yes, really. This Shop Monkey quote still blows me away. We've made 17 hires in the last 60 days. We'll never go back to hiring the old way. If you're tired of hiring in the Stone Ages and you want to do it right, check them out now at soidiv.link/G2I. There are going to be a couple steps to this one today. Pun not intended, but we'll go with it. A few things we're going to need to talk about as we go through. First, of course, what is the Workflows SDK? 2, what other options exist? And of course, number 3, why is everyone so upset? Because a lot of people are upset. In particular, Tanner Lindsley, who, as you guys know, is a good friend and one of the smartest people I know. He has feelings, and I actually don't think I agree. He did write a blog post, which is one of the many things we'll be going through. I have a bad feeling this is going to be a long video. So let's start at the top level of what the hell are workflows and what is this workflow SDK? The simplest way I can put it is it's a way to take a function in JavaScript and break it up into pieces that can rerun over long amounts of time and execute in ways that you wouldn't normally execute a function. Traditionally, when you write JavaScript, it goes line after line after line, calling whatever functions you have inside of it, and it will probably hit things throughout, especially if you have a lot of async await calls. Like, what happens if this fails? What do you do? Do you go up a level and retry the whole function? Because like, we got the user fine, we generated the email fine, but then the send failed. Do we retry at the top level and go through it again? Do we maybe write send email in a way where it retries itself 3 times? What if we wanted to send another email a week from now? There are so many things that are hard to do when you have these workflows that have multiple things going on in them that might not even be part of your own service. Like in this case, your get user comes from the database, generate email might come from an LLM or an agent or a series of agents, and the send email might be a third-party service like Resend. Any one of these can have a failure, and if any of those things fail or don't go quite as expected, the whole function has to rerun if you're even catching that in the first place. There are a lot of solutions for this type of work, but there's kind of 2 directions you can go with it. There's the retry problem, which is how are you handling errors? What are you doing about them? But then there's the long-running problem, where some of these workflows are going to run for longer than the server that they're running on might even exist. There's actually a pretty good example in here with the sending of an email 7 days later, where you get the user, you send them a welcome email, then you wait 7 days, and then you send an email 1 week later as a check-in to make sure they're doing well. This type of code can be written on a traditional server. It can't be written on Vercel because on Vercel, you have a Lambda or whatever equivalent they're using at any given time with fluid compute that has a specific amount of time it's allowed to run, up to around 800 seconds if I recall, which means you can't wait 7 days. But Theo, I'm using a real server. I can wait 7 days. What happens if you redeploy? Seriously, think about it for a second. If you have code that is running and it's waiting for 7 days before doing the next thing, and you deploy a new version of that code, are you just going to kill the old server? Are you going to let it keep running until everything else that's still on it finishes? What happens if the server has to restart? What if another process crashes it? What if a developer ships an update? What if the syntax for the function changes? What if any of these things happen? Your code that is sitting for 7 days waiting breaks. And that's why there's a whole industry of workflow providers that are ways to break up your code as a third-party service to handle these types of things. You can spin up a cron and pray a whole bunch, but you can also use other services. The best known one is temporal.io. I still cannot believe they raised such an insane amount of money. I still don't know many users of Temporal. I just know a lot of people who talk about it and think about it a lot. Again, send email, wait 30 days, then send another email. This type of code is something a lot of people want to be able to write because the alternative is letting the logic live outside of your code. Here's a weird way to think about things. You have your code base, and within your code base, you have functions. Chances are you have a bunch of these in your code base. Who doesn't? Let's say this function calls some subfunctions that might fail. I'll make it yellow to indicate like this might not run properly. These ones always pass. These ones always run as expected. But what if one of them doesn't? How do you handle that within your code base? Traditionally, you've had to do some things that I don't necessarily love. The reality is that your code base is inside of something else. Your code base is inside of your infra. And if your code base swaps out because you just shipped a new version of it, but the context of what's going on lives inside of a single function inside of that code base, you're screwed. So what ends up happening is parts of this function get moved out of the code base into some other piece of infra, like a third-party provider like Temporal, in order to call the functions in your code base via API calls. So you end up with your infra, and then some other infra, like let's say you're using Temporal, and you put this function in here. This function has steps, and this function now has to call other things. So it will call this function maybe, get back a response. And this is all over HTTP now, by the way. Get a response. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it has to call something else. But you've now pulled this code, this functionality, this behavior out of your code base and moved it externally. And chances are you also have to store what its current state is, which means it's not a variable in the code anymore. It's now an external value in a database that has to be pulled from. This takes something that should have been simple, like code that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, breaks it out into different infrastructure, and all of those layers are now things that you have to encode in your database, in multiple code bases in different places. It's now an infra orchestration problem. And for a lot of places, this is necessary. Services like Temporal do make this easier by giving you an SDK that lets you write code that's in your code base, and they manage the current state of things and try to keep things in flow in a relatively simple way. There's also other services like Ingest that does a really good job with this. This is the one that I've historically used and had a really good experience with overall. You define steps, and then you can call these steps from other steps and have different pieces throughout. You can call step.sleep if you want to take a break. When you put a step.sleep in something and you have a value above, you need to make sure the value stays the same, which makes a lot of this stuff more complex. There's also trigger.dev, which is another one I really like. The founders of Trigger are awesome. I've had such a great experience hanging out with and chatting with these guys. And you'll see, again, a lot of similarities where we have tasks, which are kind of like steps. And we do things in here. We wait for completions. If there's no result, we throw an error. Image, we wait for that. If there's no result, we throw an error. Then we return it. You also have schedules where you can set up tasks. You can wait for things. So here they have the wait.for. You're getting the idea. A lot of these things are similar concepts of keeping your execution reliable and having workflows where different steps can happen. There are people arguing that what Temporal does is different, and in a lot of ways it is, because it doesn't have some of these concepts, but it really wants to make sure every step in your code succeeds if it possibly can succeed. A lot of the branding for these will be create fail-proof apps, create reliable code. The goal here is to make it so code where there are lots of layers that have potential to have errors are less likely to not have the errors, but be blocked by those errors. If you have a function like, let's say, we go back to the example here with the email send. Let's say that creating a user has a 0.5% fail rate. Sending the welcome email has a 1% fail rate. And then sending the 1 week check-in email also has a 1% failure rate. Those add up really quickly. That'd be 0.995 times 0.99 times 0.99. You're now down to 97.5% reliability on that. That means that 2 out of every 100 users are going to hit an error. But if each of these steps you're willing to retry 3 times, you take the 0.05 to the power of 3. That's a much lower failure rate when you're willing to retry it 3 times. You could surely write code that does that, but that's just one of the layers. So the thing to really consider here is that there are errors that you want to retry from, and there are workflows and timelines and schedules that you want to run with. But none of these things really fit in your code. Ideally, your code is as simple as do this, then this, then this. But the reality is that the things we do are not that reliable, especially in this world where we're calling all these different tools, we're hitting all these different services, we're sending emails, we're interacting. Every one of these steps has a chance of failing. So we could write our code entirely different. We could call each of these functions with a wrapper that will do retries and handle errors. Sure. We could go all in on something like effect. Cool. But then what happens when we need to wait 7 days? The durability and the scheduling are 2 difficult problems, and the solution to both is to make your code way less readable and descriptive of what you actually want it to do. Ideally, code should be as simple as describing the intent of what you want. It should be as simple as the code is here. We should be able to just create a user, send them an email, wait 7 days, and then send another email. But due to the nature of how infrastructure works, of how code works, of how servers work, this has not been achievable. So what Vercel has done here is added directives and a ton of compiler hacks to make it possible. And I think the result's actually pretty cool. Vercel's not paying me for any of this. I had no idea this was happening ahead of time. I went in very skeptical. It's like, oh God, more directives. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've come around to this. Not because I think every single complex existing system or workflow could be moved to this and it'd be great, but I think more and more developers are starting to encounter the need for these types of things. I'm going to do my favorite thing. Make a spectrum out of something that is not actually a spectrum at all. This is the how important are your errors spectrum. You might recognize this because I've covered it before. On one side, there's meh, you don't really care. On the other side, if we error, people die. Like you're building medical tech or something like that. So on one side of this, you're probably not writing tests. You don't care too much about type safety. You're throwing any's all over the code base. Who cares? On the other side, every single line of code is vetted by 5 people. You have a crazy suite of tests. You're doing everything you can to make sure your code doesn't have any unexpected consequences and that the expected consequences are within your tolerance for errors. As you go up and down the spectrum, the things you're interested in, the tools you use, and the way you build will change a lot. Where on this side, you might be playing with vanilla JS. On the other side, you're probably playing with something like Rust. The reason you might recognize the spectrum is my previous video on never throw, effect, and also my crappy little wrapper for promises, my try catch wrapper that gives you the error and like null cases. So you have like const, results, error. You know, the classic stealing Golang syntax. So imagine you're building an app. And this is your app. This is the space in which you have to care. And your app is writing code that like hits a database once per API request. The database is more reliable than your actual code is, so it's probably fine. You don't care too much because it's generating images for people of their dogs or whatever. Who cares? But then you start using a third-party service that errors in a couple different ways. Now your endpoints are throwing random errors and you're getting frustrated with it. So you decide you want to handle this better. You could try out my try-catch wrapper, and maybe this is enough. Maybe the line for where this is good enough is here, and your code doesn't pass that line, so you don't care. So you're fine here. You're happy with the try-catch wrapper. It more than carries you. Maybe that's not enough, and you're seeing more and more things that are hitting errors. Maybe it's time to move to never throw, which is a great library. Never throw is an attempt at a somewhat minimal layer to add to your TypeScript where you, instead of throwing an error, you return an error type, and you strictly make sure that you're doing this everywhere where an error can possibly happen. So here we have an imaginary database, and this imaginary database can have an insert function that might error. So we wrap this with a result async.fromThrowable for this, and then we return our own custom error here. I also notice there's a typo here. There should be another parenthesis there. Response type of user results, yada. Now, this could be safer than using result async from promise with the result of a function call, because not all functions that return a promise are async, and thus they can throw errors synchronously rather than returning a rejected promise. Yeah, you see, JavaScript's not a great language. Regardless, I've had a lot of fun with Neverthrow. It tends to be my solution when I'm running into too much complexity in our error management, and I just want to know where things are failing a bit more reliably. It's helped me clean up a lot of code and better understand why things are failing. But if that's not enough, to be real, for T3 chat, it's not enough. Because as much as people like to say T3 chat's just a light wrapper, oh man, I wish it was. The amount of random places things can go wrong at the level of throughput we're doing, every way a service can fail, it will for us hundreds of times, which is why Effect has been really good for us. Effect is effectively a whole new language on top of TypeScript, within TypeScript, that lets you write code in a very different way that requires you to rewire your brain a whole bunch, but it makes it way easier to manage the workflows that you're running, to manage the code that's executing, when it's executing, how values are propagated through that code, how you handle errors, how you handle concurrency, async, and so much more. It's a higher level rethinking of how you should write your applications on the server side especially. We use this for upload thing because we had so many layers of asynchronous bullshit that it made way easier to keep track of, that I love. It's also very functional programming build, which I also love. I know I'm going to become a big Effect guy once I dive in a little deeper. I had just started before I had to have my hand surgery and just have been demotivated from using my computer throughout a lot of that time. So I haven't had the proper deep dive just yet, but I do plan to. Point of this is that at different points in your developer journey, the need for things like this becomes much clearer as you get to those points. If you're working on small side projects with a couple friends, you might look at Effect and be like, what the fuck? Why would anyone ever want this? But if you're building really complex asynchronous workflows and you're used to languages that handle these things better, you might look at Effect and be like, oh my God, why isn't everyone using this? Now that we've said that, I want to bring back another spectrum I've talked about a lot. This one's going to feel really out of place, so just listen to me for a second. This is the how complex of web tooling do you need? So if you're building a website and it's a static blog, your needs are very different from something like Figma, which is a really complex web application. So if you're on a static blog, you're fine just writing HTML. But if you're in Figma, you're probably deep in Canvas hell. I bring this up because there's different technologies that are beneficial on different sides of the spectrum. Something like React, I would argue, fits pretty well here. Where if you're building a mostly static site, React's not going to benefit you at all. And if you're building something dynamic enough, React won't help you much there either. But stock vanilla just HTML is pretty limited in how far it can get you before you're miserable. The problem here is that there are lots of categories of sites where HTML isn't quite enough, but it sucks that you feel like you have to adopt React just to add something. So if you have a blog with a dynamic comment section, suddenly stock HTML isn't enough. You need to bring in some JavaScript, and you can go write all that JavaScript by hand yourself. And now you're going to deal with a lot of weird, annoying edge cases and things, especially if you want to have an experience where you hit post for your comment and the page doesn't have to refresh. It just shows up in the UI. Good luck doing that vanilla. You'll probably at least bring in something like jQuery. It'll make life easier. But man, this is when you're going to start reaching for a framework. But the reality is that you'll be right on the edge of where the framework becomes useful. And it kind of sucks that up until this point, it feels like HTML is enough. So why the hell am I talking about HTML and Figma when I'm supposed to be talking about durable workflows and execution? Because there's another framework I haven't got to talk about in a while that people don't realize how much I like, HTMX. The magic of HTMX is not that it can replace React in the majority of websites. The magic of HTMX is it meaningfully increases how far you can go before you have to adopt React. HTMX allows for these minimal but meaningful interactions on your websites, things like your comment section in your blog, things like your shopping cart on an e-commerce site, things like basic feed management in a Twitter clone where you post and it just appears in the feed. These types of things previously benefited greatly from bringing in a framework, even if you only had one or two things like that in your code base. And it sucks that 90% of what users are seeing can be done static via HTML, but then there's that small little like 10, 5, maybe even 1% left that makes you feel like you need to bring in the framework. And the result is you have a lot of people who end up resenting the framework because they don't want to use React. They feel like they have to use React because it solves one small specific problem that their framework or tool of choice isn't quite equipped for. And I think it's awesome that HTMX allows for devs that want to just do static HTML, that don't really want to build client-side JavaScript anything, to make a website that auto-updates on submit without having to go all in on building a JavaScript framework or bringing one in to build around. That's a good thing. This is why, despite me obviously being someone who leans in the React direction, I still really deeply appreciate HTMX because it has allowed for people to not need React when they just want to go a little further than their existing tools allow. You might see where I'm going with this. You could argue that there are two spectrums to the stuff that Vercel is cooking. There's the durability side, which is how much does this need to handle errors? This is what something like Effect would handle well. But then there is the longevity, scheduling, management, I would say. Don't really have a good word for this side. There are the two directions here, though, where one is about how well do you handle and recover from errors, and the other is how well do you handle scheduling as part of the tool that you're using. Something like Effect handles durability really well, and it can help some amount with scheduling, but once your server has to restart, it stops helping there. So like Effect would be here, where it's really durable, but doesn't necessarily help enough with scheduling. It's probably a little further, but then once the server dies, stops being helpful. So you have to ask yourself, where does your app go? Most apps, I would argue, are in this general range, where they don't necessarily care about scheduling something a week from now or errors because they're just hitting their own database. It's unlikely that they are doing much that would require to better handling of errors or like context over time. But as your app gets more and more complex, as you hit more and more edges, you bring in more services, you have more errors, you're using LLMs for things more and more, you'll eventually hit a point where your shit's erroring way more than you want it to, and you have more problems that require scheduling than you expected. If you're just having errors, if you're just experiencing that as you go up this direction, it makes a lot of sense to bring in tools like Neverthrow or Effect. But if you're also having problems with scheduling, like let's say you want to send an email a week after the user signs up, or you're using GPT-5 Pro, which can take 10 to 30 minutes to send a response, these types of things suck if your server might be replaced in the time the execution is happening. What I think is really cool about what Vercel has done here is they've effectively extended the safe range for just writing the code. If you were to not bring in any of the tools we've mentioned so far, if you were to just write code in vanilla JS and TS, I would argue anything past like this point, and you're going to start running into problems. If you need more durability, if you have things that are failing, it's probably time to bring in at least a wrapper for promises. And if you want to handle more complex scheduling tasks, you might need to bring in something like Trigger or something like Ingest. What's cool about what Vercel has done here is they've effectively extended how far you can go before you need tools like that. So if this box is vanilla JSTS, what Vercel has done with workflows is allowed you to not feel like you're leaving the tools or the systems that you're familiar with. You don't have to learn a new syntax. You don't have to learn a new way of writing functions. You don't have to learn the quirks of when you call step dot whatever inside of a nested function that is sometimes being run on someone else's server, sometimes being run on yours. Instead, you're adding one string right underneath your function definition and meaningfully extending how durable your workflows are and how well you can handle these types of execution. This is why I am excited, because right now I'm running into problems with T3 chat that would benefit greatly from having the ability to wait an amount of time or re-execute with the current context when something happens. Seriously, this is going to make it so we can actually support GPT-5 Pro and other slow models, which I'm excited about because historically it's been really annoying to do with the way that we run code on Vercel. There are a lot of edges that make this kind of annoying, though, and it seems like Vercel has handled a significant number of them. One of the key pieces is the deterministic nature of these types of things. Let's say we want to time something. Cool. So I just made this fake copy of this. Let's say you want to keep track of when this started. So you have const started at equals new date. And then at the end, you want to have started at returned here. There's a big problem. Since we have this await sleep 7 days, it might seem like our code is just going line by line by line, and then it waits for 7 days, then the next thing runs. But reality is not so simple. You can't just sleep 7 days on a node that might not exist in 7 days. This code that we're running here, this instance that we're running, might not exist anymore by the time that step is completed. So what do? We recreate each of these calls to get to the next step. When the 7 days is done, we don't just immediately run this. We need to recreate the context on how we got here. But if we rerun this code 7 days later, the started at's now going to be wrong. It's going to be the time from that rerun. It's not going to be the time from the original run. These are the types of things that make it annoying to just do this and split up your functions. And the harsh reality is that the solution is often to go store a bunch of this stuff in database, keep partial states along the way, and have individual functions that get called on a cron or something along those lines when you do it by hand. Annoying as hell, to put it lightly. So what Vercel is doing here for you is every time you call an await on something that is defined as a use step, so here we have charge payment has use step, now it's going to try and retry that step up to 3 times by default. If it succeeds, it will store the result in a cache that they manage for you, as well as any additional variables you hit and things like the new date call that happened here. They will cache what the result was, so when they have to rerun this function to resume where you were, they can get you exactly where it was before. This is far from the first time I've heard people having to patch date in order to do stuff like this. Everyone from Cloudflare has done this to prevent Spectre attacks to Convex to make transactions more accurate. Everyone that's doing weird things with the JavaScript runtime eventually has to patch date. It's almost a rite of passage once you're doing an interesting enough task with this godforsaken language. The things you have to do to make your workflows and your runs and your functions deterministic, regardless of when they're being run or rerun, is difficult because the state could be different depending on when you rerun it. They had to handle a lot of things to fix it. The sandbox environments that workflows are run in already ensure determinism. For instance, map.random and date constructors are fixed in workflow runs, so you're safe to use them, and the framework ensures the values don't change across replays. You get the idea? Pretty cool. And again, the code is really simple. You're not really making your code more complex. This is something I strive for, and this is why I like stuff like React hooks. It lets you write the code how I would describe the thing to somebody. First, we create the user. Then we send them an email. Then we wait 7 days. Then we send them the check-in email. And in a world where you have AI agents that are calling dozens of different tools from various different services where any one of them could fail at any time, having a workflow that will more reliably retry those things along the way is a really good thing. If you have an AI agent that is doing 2 search calls and maybe writing something to a DB when it finds certain data, if any one of those steps can fail and then you have to rerun the whole thing, that sucks. But if you can store each of those steps along the way, or even cooler, if you can pass tools to an agent that are steps that can be retried along the way, it no longer matters that you deterministically describe these things as this is the 7 steps that always happen. The fact that a workflow can have a variable set of steps based on the conditions is really cool. For what it is worth, another one of my favorite things, Convex, has workflows as well. And I've used these a bit for handling migrations for T3 chat. You can describe an action, which can be run as a step.run action. And you can even say to run this step after a certain amount of time. Really cool. I like this a lot in Convex. But the nature of Vercel's runtime is really, really powerful here. The combination of fluid compute, where you only build on active CPU time, alongside the deeper integration with full node support, it's so cool. And like, I have so many tasks where this will make my life meaningfully easier already. I'm excited. Like, this is one of those things that makes me more excited to build more complex things, because now I need way less complex tooling to do it. If I want to bring in 15 API calls to random shit like FAL or EXA or all these services, it's way easier for me to make that reliable without introducing a bunch of complex tooling, changing the syntax, and making my code less readable. If I was to rewrite this with effect, there are like 7 people who would be like, oh yeah, that's way cleaner. And then the rest of us would be like, what the fuck is that? How am I supposed to understand this? As I said, if you get it, you get it. But if you don't, yeah. So what's the controversy? Why are people so upset about this? Is it because they're huge convex fanboys? Is it because they hate Vercel? It's because a lot of people don't like directives. I'll start with Tanner's takes because I have a lot of respect for Tanner. I'll continue to die on the hill of magic directives are a bad API interface. They're not type safe, they're not extensible, there's no native runtime control, they're just strings. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'd rather debate at directives. Please rewind history. Oh, also, I hate decorators. Just use first-class functions or higher-order functions or something composable, merely trying to make a point that this is worse than even that. He also wrote a blog post, a quiet trend in the JS ecosystem. For years, JS has had exactly one meaningful directive, use strict. It is standardized, enforced by runtimes, and it behaves the same in every environment. It represents a clear contract between the language, the engines, and developers. But now we're watching a new trend emerge. Frameworks are inventing their own top-level directives. Use client, use server, use cache, use workflow, and more are appearing across the ecosystem. They look like language features. They sit where real language features sit. They affect how code is interpreted, bundled, and executed. There's an important distinction, though. These are not standard JS features. Runtimes don't understand them, there is no governing specification, and each framework is free to define its own meaning, rules, and edge cases. This can feel ergonomic today, but it also increases confusion, complicates debugging, and imposes costs on tooling and portability, which are patterns we've seen before. We'll see how I feel as we go through. I really want to present his take as is and then give my counter after. When directives look like the platform, developers will treat them like the platform. A directive at the top of a file looks authoritative. It gives the impression of being a language-level truth, not a framework hint. That creates a perception problem. Developers assume that directives are an official thing. Ecosystems begin to treat them as a shared API surface. New learners struggle to distinguish JavaScript from framework magic. The boundaries between platform and vendor blur, and debuggability suffers, and tooling must special case all of these behaviors. We've already seen this confusion before. Many developers now believe use client and use server are just how modern JS works, unaware that they only exist inside specific build pipelines and server component semantics. I don't know if I agree with that. I might be in the bubble of like competent devs, but I've never seen anyone who thought use client and use server were things that just exist in the language. I think it's pretty well understood that those are React things. Is this me speaking from the bubble, or have you guys encountered people who thought that use client and use server were existing things, not just parts of React? A few people have also said that they've seen this. Use server was named wrong. I'll continue to be annoying about that. I would wonder, though, if instead of just use client and use server, they had done use React client and use React action, would that have been enough for people to be quiet about this point? Because this feels like a small piece of the argument, that people believe that this is a native language feature. I've just never seen that argument before. Okay, chat saying that would have been better. I think for a majority of devs who don't keep up to date on things, they will start seeing the new directives and likely be confused by where the things came from. Yeah, use client is client to server boundary, use server is the opposite. I don't think use client created confusion. I think use server did, because it sounds like they're inversed, which they are on a deep fundamental level, but they're not on a top level, because use client is how you define a client component. So a lot of people assume use server is how you define a server component, but it's not. It's how you define a function on the server that the client can call. I don't think islands are the solution here at all. Islands only go one way. They didn't call it use action because they have aspirations for it to do other things. So yeah, that one's a small point. Let's keep reading, though. I don't know if the debuggability problems are because of the directives so much as the things the directives represent are inherently complex. Credit where it's due. Use server and use client. Oh boy, is he going to agree with some pieces here? Some directives exist because multiple tools needed a single, simple coordination point. In practice, use server and use client are pragmatic shims that tell bundlers and runtimes where code is allowed to execute in a server component world. They've seen relatively broad support across bundlers precisely because the scope is narrow. Execution, location. That said, even these show the limits of directives once real-world needs appear. At scale, you often need parameters and policies that matter deeply to correctness and security. HTTP methods, headers, middleware, auth-context tracing, caching behaviors, and more. Directives have no natural place to carry those options, which means they're frequently ignored, bolted on elsewhere, or re-encoded as new directive variants. I see a lot of these things as growing pains or one-time fixes. Like, most of what you do through use server is going to use a post HTTP method. Middleware is functions that are commonly called in API endpoints. I think those being abstracted in a reliable way is better. Headers, you shouldn't be putting different headers on every request from the client side, ideally. Auth context is probably the most annoying one. I agree with that. Tracing is annoying whenever you go across a network boundary. Caching behaviors are annoying whenever you go across a network boundary. These are things that are always annoying. I don't agree that directives make them more annoying. I think directives let them not be annoying when they aren't problems, and they are just as annoying when they are problems. I think a lot about is this tool making me write code that I can't rewrite another way? Is this locking me in because now I have to rewrite everything to fix it? Or is it locking me in because it's letting me not do those things yet, but eventually I have to write the same code I would have if I just never used the thing in the first place? It's a balance. So here's where directives start to strain, according to Tanner. The options in directive adjacent APIs. When a directive immediately or soon after creation needs options or spawns siblings, like use cache : remote, and helper calls, like cache life, that's often a signal that the feature wants to be an API, not a string at the top of a file. If you know you need a function anyway, just use a function for all of it. I'll admit I haven't looked too deeply in the new use cache stuff yet because I've been really busy and I'm more excited about the workflow stuff. And there's a good chance that the use cache stuff goes against how I like using directives. So here is what Tanner recommends instead of use cache. You have an explicit API, use cache from next cache. You wrap the function with cache. You have a strategy and a TTL bound there. I do like that more for caching. And for server behaviors where the details matter, import server from acme/runtime, servers defined with a request response, and then you have the methods here as optional arguments. I see it for actions, but there's a problem. The magic of userver, and I fought about this with the guy who proposed userver, who wrote the whole spec for it, who implemented it, Sebastian Markbridge, because I had the exact same take Tanner had here. And he gave a really compelling counterexample. Let's say we have this row component. We've all had to render a table with data in it. There's a parent that has all of the data, and it's passing the item data and the item ID to each of these things. Now we want to make a delete button that works. How do we do this? Well, we can await fetch /API/items/item ID. Now this has to be async. Method delete. Get some not type safe data back. Hope it's good. Post a toast. Then go trigger the parent re-render and do all these other things. Fine, annoying. But what if I want to have this function defined in a way that I can just call it? I can do what Tanner suggests and have const delete action equals server ID return, and instead await this. The harsh reality is that this is still compiler magic. If you have these in the same file, some compiler is hijacking this and putting different code in your bundle than is being written otherwise. So the code I wrote here, sure, obviously the JSX is going to be compiled in something else, whatever. But the fact that this whole function gets yoinked out and replaced with a fetch call is relatively unintuitive, because it's weird that a specific keyword that I import is going to change how this code gets compiled entirely. This isn't doing what a function does. Functions that wrap functions are called as part of your call stack. Functions named server, as Tanner is showcasing here, don't do that. They are compilers. You're replacing a magic string with a magic function. And the other thing here is that all context you need now has to be passed into this. So if I had const rendered at equals use memo, new date, and I want to keep track of when this was rendered at when I do the deletion for some reason. There's a lot of other reasons you might do something like this inline. You might have other data that exists in this component that you want to use. I can manually pass all of these things over, but wouldn't it be nice if I could just define this function right here where I have to define a function anyways? That's what makes userver cool, is it will include all of the context of everything that happened here. Console.log, this was rendered at, and instead of calling this delete action, you can do whatever you would have done there. So db.delete item ID. Instead of response, is now result, because this is actual server code. We don't care about what it returns to the client because we just want to revalidate. So we could even call the revalidate path helper to revalidate the current content, or revalidate tag with whatever the database call was for that. This is what makes userver cool, is it allows for functions that conceptually exist within a component to actually exist within the component and include the context of what is around the component. This isn't a security risk. People seem to think it is because they have fundamental misunderstandings of how it's implemented. The context of what is defined on the client side is included in the thing that goes to the server. Yeah, that's how client side works. This is a really cool behavior that if all the tooling and everything was being implemented correctly and people understood it, would be a much better way to define component-specific server-side behaviors within the component itself. Instead of the component calling an endpoint, the component defines a function that at comp time becomes an endpoint. I don't know why we like comp time stuff when we're in C and Zig, but we hate it in React and JavaScript, but it's effectively what's going on here. There is also a little hidden thing here that makes this not valid that no one's called out yet. You guys are calling me out for things that don't matter, but not the one that does. Since I have a use memo call here, this would have to be a use client component. And since this is now use client, I can't call use server in it. So I would have to define this in the parent and then pass it down, thereby destroying a lot of the potential benefit of this whole pattern. That's where the model actually falls apart. Not security, not directives, not the lack of wrappers. It falls apart because you can't compose use client and use server together for reasons that do make sense, because a file that only runs on server should not have client code in it. Yeah. If you're struggling to understand what my take is here, it's because I am too. There are benefits and negatives to all of this. It's not so simple as this is all bad. The idea of directives as ways to tell the compiler where this code runs is a lot nicer than having to spin up fucking Terraform and configure different code bases entirely for the different things. If you can define in your code what you want to have happen, and you want it to happen on a different place, either the user's device or a server or in a durable execution layer, and you can do that by adding one string, that's a good thing. A wrapper does not communicate that it's different. I don't think functions should be used to make code run somewhere else personally, because functions are used to run code. They have simple inputs and outputs. I like that we have something different we can use for when the code should be executed somewhere different. People are mad at me for bringing up the Terraform thing. I guess I have to elaborate more on that part. Yeah, you guys are all mad at me for that. That's fine. You're all wrong. Let me explain why you guys are all wrong. There are two problems here. One is syntax for code that runs somewhere else is one of the two problems. And then there's the actually running the code somewhere else part. It is very common that developers have a multiple computers problem, where you have code that you want to have run in multiple places. Some code runs on your server, some code runs on your users' devices. Same code base, same syntax means that you want a solution that lets you write code the way you normally write code in the same code base that you're already writing the code in. So the place that you're writing the client-side code and the server-side code should have the same syntax, same style, same everything for client and server. This is how TanStack Start does it. You write code in a way where if you want a server-side function, you wrap your function with server. What Vercel is doing with directives is more same code base, different syntax, where they chose directives as the solution to communicate that these different things run in different places. Different code base, same syntax. This is using a TypeScript monorepo, stuff like TRPC and whatnot. And once you actually want to start deploying it, this is where Terraform and tools like that come in, because you need a way to define with different code that runs in different places and provisioning all of that instead of it all coming from the same code base. Now you need to handle the fact that you need to deploy code that clients receive on a CDN, and you also need to deploy code that the servers are running on a server. And if you, God forbid, have different types of servers throughout this, now you're running into the problems that hopefully the new workflow stuff will solve. Different code base, different syntax. Now we're in traditional REST land. So the reason that I'm bringing up stuff like Terraform is that that is how you handle things on this side of the world, where you have different code bases, or maybe you have like a monorepo, but different packages within the monorepo, one for the backend side, one for the client side. Tanner's here, so hopefully he'll be able to correct any bad assumptions I have. But CJE's also here. I'm dealing with API design for a multiple computers problem right now. Not related to front end and back end, though. It's like different, like he works at Axiom, so like ingest servers, API servers, all of these things are complex. It's so hard to explain to even quite skilled developers. Even basic stuff like, it might be hard to talk to the same database from both places. Yeah, this is what's so hard. Everything from how you deploy to where you deploy, to how you bundle, to where you send code, this stuff is hard. And eventually you'll run into these problems. But ideally, the tools we use will get us further and further before you even notice you're having those problems. And that was the goal with use server and use client and server components, was how can React think about this relationship between servers and clients that gets you far enough that you might not end up needing to reach for Relay to have a good experience. So the point I'm trying to make is ignore all of this. We have all in the web dev world recognized that this level of splitting things up when you don't need to doesn't matter. What we care about now is when we're solving the multi-computer problem, do we want a different syntax for it, or do we want to use the existing syntax? Both of these solutions are using a compiler step to split the code up. So some code goes to the server, some code goes to the client, and some code goes to both. This is a matter of should the thing that does that changes the way that the code that you're writing is actually running, should something that changes how the code runs and where the code runs just use function syntax? This is a debate that is worth having. This is a section Tanner just updated that he told me to take a look at now. Considering APIs instead of directives for option-rich features. Durable execution is a good example, like use workflow and use step. But the point in general, directives can collapse behavior to a Boolean, while many features benefit from options and room to evolve. Compilers and transformers can support either surface. This is about choosing the right one for longevity and clarity. So here's one option, an explicit API with provenance and options. So we have a workflow wrapper here. We pass it our function, and we say this one can be retried 3 times and has a timeout of 1 minute. And then we have a step, fetch user, which has a cache of 60. I do like the syntax, but there's a reason that it's not ideal I'll get to in a second. Function forms can be just as AST and transform friendly as directives, and they carry provenance, which is imports in this case, and type safety. Yes, like this should solve all of the problems, but there are edges where it doesn't that make it much more complex on this side. You can also inject a global once, and now it just exists everywhere, which is cool, but I don't like magic variables that are defined globally. You'll end up with the same problem that we have here with beginner devs, where if they start working in a code base where these things are already done, they just think they can call the word workflow anywhere, and it's not that simple. The average React dev has never started a React code base, which I hate. The average React devs never run create React app or create next app. They just started using the existing code base at their workplace that has thousands of things already defined in it. Okay, Tanner, I'm not saying that magic variables are worse than directives here. I'm saying that they have the same problem if you do a global definition like that. I'm not in favor of the global thing. I think we all agree. It seems like chat very much agrees, like doing this as a global definition, not something that we would recommend. So here is the thing that I actually think makes the directives part really cool. So here we have use step for calling an API, and if the response status is 500, we throw an error. Let's say that for different error cases, we want to change how many retries we do. We can do a top-level number of retries like this, which I fucking hate. I hate defining values on a function like this so much. This is my least favorite syntax in JavaScript. When I learned you have to do this on page components in order to get data for it on the client side when you're trying to figure out what's going on in your component hierarchy, I hate this syntax so much. I hate doing this. A function's a function. Don't put values on it. That said, what I do really like here is when you call their helper error types, you can change how many retries occur. So here we're throwing a retriable error, and in this case, we are changing the retry behavior in a condition internally. I don't love the idea of defining these conditions externally, because in a lot of cases, we don't want to retry 3 times if we're hitting a too many tries error. In the case where we want to do a back off because we're hitting a rate limit, we want to have a different behavior than if we're hitting an error because of a random one-off thing. So I don't necessarily agree that it's a straight up benefit just having the wrapper be the place where you define these behaviors, because the behaviors can vary a lot internally. Twitch Tanner says, sure, throw a retry error, that's fine. Retry is just an example of an option that would need to wrap or influence the compiler action. Boundaries need to come from somewhere, which is why he prefers imports. If ecosystem's goal, make an ecosystem level import for everyone. When you do this, you create a standard. Standards need versioning, context, etc. Tell you when directives can do this and you listen. I think I'm figuring out how to phrase the points of disagreement on the user journey, because there's every step along the way, one of these solutions is slightly better or worse. So the reason I like directives for the like very start, somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, that's just looking at the code base for the first time, is that it makes it very clear that this is different from wrapping with a function. If I'm going into a code base that uses useServer and useWorkflow, and I don't know anything about JavaScript at all, it would stand out that these things are defined differently than functions. Whereas in something like TanStack start, the server function is another function, so to speak. So initially, I don't see those as different. But then if I actually know JavaScript, but I don't know these frameworks, one of these is much clearer because it's a function. It's obviously going to affect the function. The other's like, what is that? A comment? Isn't this only a thing you use for useStrict? What does that do? Is there a new feature in JavaScript I don't know about? So like step 0, I don't even know JavaScript. Directives make it clear that this is different from functions. Any amount more familiarity, and directives now feel like a feature that is confusing, whereas the functions less so. And as you go further down the line, the benefits and negatives of each occur. But I would argue the like biggest benefit that I'm arguing in favor of here is that different infra should, in my opinion, equal different syntax. That ideally, something that changes where and how the code runs should have a different syntax to indicate that. That's like very big and explicit and clear. I'd be okay with like the way macros work in Bun, where you have to import with for something like that. When you're going across boundaries, that could work for this. I'd have to see what it would look like in this type of context. But the other side here is that they're not configurable. They are not standard. They look like a language feature when they aren't. And you can just use functions. Oh, actually, more points in favor of Tanner and against this is out of code base, composability is shit. So like if I have a package that I want to provide to you as a user that has the ability to include steps or server or use server, use client, all those things, providing those in a package sucks because anything I use to try and bundle that and send it to you as a consumer on the other side is going to trim all that shit out. And chances are the bundler you're using for your code base doesn't even have the ability to introspect that and find it from packages anyways. So the composability, especially outside of your code base, is fucking garbage. Tanner's argument needs to be traceable, need to have imports, NPM, GitHub, spec, version, all the above. As Gabriel says, also at Axiom, he's been writing more and more library code every day. This is becoming more and more important. Agree. I said I was going to piss everyone off with this video, and it seems like I'm doing a good job so far. This comment I'm going to go in on. This is not an attack on you at all, plus Q, but I think this perfectly represents why I like directives. To me, it's unclear where directives are defined and come from versus importing a function from a package. Here is the harsh reality. You can't import infrastructure. You can't import someone else's computer. You can't import the server. You can't import a user. Those are things that aren't code in the traditional sense. This isn't a debate of whether or not a directive should just be a wrapper because a wrapper is the same thing and the directive is just wrapping the function. Like, directives are not decorators. They're not a way to change the functionality of a function. They are not adding a layer to the function in the sense they're not just like wrapping it with some stuff. The point of directives is that they are defining differences in where this code should execute, at least in the context of the things we're talking about. I don't know if I'm just thinking too much in like functional purity, but wrapping a function in a function is hijacking the inputs and outputs, not hijacking the code itself. Where it runs is junior speak. It waters down when you sell market it, but that's not what's happening. Tanner, how do you feel about the syntax that Naman was sharing, this idea of a like addendum to your imports? Import API function from server file with on : server. So it's similar to the macro syntax here. My holdup is very specifically that wrapping a function means something different than what I'm seeing directives used for. And I don't like the idea of function composition implying this. The only problem I see with this is what was just said by Dev, which is that it forces you to move the function to a new file, which I don't love. Before use server, this was not taught or understood. I agree, but directives weren't used before either. I see this as useful as in it indicates that this is different from a function wrapper. It is hard for me to get over this idea of wrapping a function with another function can change where it executes and can like have this type of behavioral change for inside of the function. Like to go back to the example on the homepage here, this could be the thing that I'm just wrong on, and I can accept that. That like when you put use workflow here, you've now fundamentally changed how this function runs. Every line, every call inside of this is going to behave differently because you put use workflow here. If instead you wrapped user sign up with like export const full sign up workflow, and you wrap user sign up with workflow, I don't like the idea that wrapping a function with another function changes how variables work inside of it. It changes how these lines behave. Is use workflow making it clear enough to a new dev or someone who's not familiar with the pattern that defining a variable now does something different than it does in a traditional function? Maybe not, but at least these two are co-located. It might be as simple as like, where do you define the fact that these calls behave different? That in this function calls work differently? I think that behavior should be inscribed within instead of externally. Because if we don't put use workflow here, it'd be possible to call user sign up somewhere else without the workflow wrapper. Sure, you can be sure to like define it and always inline the function, things like that, kind of. But the idea of changing the way this executes, like I like to think of functions as magic boxes. You don't care about what goes on inside. If you wrap a function in another function and the external one changes how the individual lines run inside of the like inner function, that is the like, I don't want to cross this line for me. And I'm tolerant of something as gross and unconfigurable and not naturally composable as directives when the alternative is a wrapper function that changes the behavior of the inner function. As was just said by Naman, in the end, these things are all compiler hacks anyways. It's all compiler magic, so they're all flawed. As the functions do anyways, though, a higher order function can change how an inner function works. It can change the inputs that are passed to the inner function. And like, to be clear, I do love the way server functions work in TanStack. Like, I do love the fact that I can define a server function, give it a handler, and just call this anywhere. That's awesome. And the fact that you can do this without compromising on the composability or the configurability, where you can change if it's going to be a get or a post by changing in the create server function, like call these things, I do really like that. But this is defined inside versus outside. This solution requires that we break out all of these behaviors and make more small functions. The thing that I haven't seen before, because I've looked at all of these other solutions for doing more resilient workflows, and every single time you end up changing how you call things, where we have to call .trigger. We have to define this as a task. Or if we go to ingest, we have our function that has an event name and then steps in it. So we call step.run for this first function, then we call step.run again for this next function. Is it that big of a change? Not necessarily, but it's not just the TypeScript that we would normally write otherwise. What I like about this, the reason that I'm into this syntax, is because it lets you write very boring idiomatic JavaScript and TypeScript and indicate that it will behave differently than normal with a thing. And personally, I think this level of compiler magic should be indicated with something novel, not with another function helper. I would also argue that what Tanner's doing is much less magical in the good sense. It's very explicit. My server time function is a server function that I define in a file and then import other places. I really like that. But when I just want to wait 7 days and send a follow-up email, it's just, we're changing how we define functions to work around this. And that is worth it when you're now committed enough to doing workflows to do that. But what's cool with the Vercel version is I can go switch to workflows on existing functions with like 2 to 3 changes that are just adding a string in random places. Like here we've, instead of send email just being a function that has multiple things in it, it's now a workflow wrapping an async function. And then the steps have to be another magic thing where I have to define it with a name separate from the variable name, and then the function there as well. Like, everyone is correct here. and everyone's kind of wrong here, but mostly everyone is correct. Like everything Tanner said in this post is true. It's all a matter of like opinions and perspective on how far these problems can go. The lock-in argument is more valid here than in other places, I would argue, because usually I argue against lock-in as a thing because people just use this to talk shit when they don't necessarily understand another thing, but that's not what's going on here. There is a real lock-in risk. Thankfully, what Vercel has done here is make an open source SDK and standard with nothing specifically tied to Vercel. The goal is to make it so you could put this anywhere, and they've documented it well enough. I do see a future where other places do this. I honestly would really like for some of the syntax to make it into convex. I think it would make a lot of the like definitions for workflows on the convex side much easier, and I'd love to play with that personally. If we want shared primitives, we should collaborate on the specs and APIs. They're absolutely real problems to solve. Server execution boundaries, streaming and async workflows, distributed runtime primitives, durable tasks, caching semantics. There's even more here too, like what happens to a durable task if the code underneath it changes out? What happens if I ship code that changes what a function expects and there's already a queued job for that function later on? Queue protection is one of those things that you don't realize you need until you really need it. And having that as part of like the built-in behaviors of the workflow stuff here is cool. But there's layers to all of this. And I personally think it's really cool when you can meaningfully increase the level of complexity your code base can cover without meaningfully increasing the complexity of the syntax. The problem here is that magic feeling of, oh, I can make something that is more reliable, more resilient with so little additional syntax, is that you're inherently foregoing a level of configurability, composability, and clarity with the people who are now writing code that way. And if you're in the weeds enough, you just stare at that like, oh my God, this is glossing over so much shit. It's making so many other important things impossible. Just use a wrapper function. And I can hear it and see it from both sides. And I don't know who is right here. All I know is that I like it, that it's a syntax that I vibe with, and I'm going to try it a bunch and see how I feel over time. I do want to run a poll. Vibes on directives, mostly good, okay-ish, leaning bad, mostly bad. I have a feeling I know how this is going to go. Remember my example here, though, before you vote. I like that use workflow exists inside the function where it's changing how each line runs. I don't like the idea of a wrapper function changing how the internal functions are executed. That I will stand on as my core argument of why I like this being inside, because it's changing how other things inside work. And ideally, a wrapper changes how the inputs and outputs of a function work, not how the inside of the function works. If you call a use step function in something that isn't use workflow, it behaves differently. Do you like the wrapper function style more if JS generators were used like an effect? So you did yield some task or something to make it more obvious the inside wasn't behaving normally? Yeah, I feel like effect is so abstracted that these things aren't as relevant. I'm also saying you could do use server, use workflow. Although what I would do is use server and then have a use workflow function defined that gets called. Okay, it seems like people here lean mostly bad, but it's not as crazy a split as I expected. The benefit of directives is the decreased flexibility, which makes it impossible to do stupid stuff. You have to define it inline in the function definition. How do you know on the outside when you call that this is going to take 7 days, not 7 microseconds? You've broken type inference completely by not having the workflow wrapper. That's a fair point. Like if the workflow is being called lower level, like inside of like nested things, this does get messier. Oh God, this is how I know we've gone too far. You are comparing me to Brian Johnson. Yeah, I would argue that you don't care about the returns on use workflow, but if it's not a wrapper, yeah, the wrapper does benefit there. I do not like the fact that I'm currently in a position where I have to defend a thing from a company I don't like, that I haven't used yet, against a lot of people who I do like that also haven't used it yet. This is a very clean solution to problems I have right now that I like more than all of the alternatives I've seen proposed. And I will come back with a more concrete thought after I've used it a bunch. I really don't like getting this deep, as Naman says, in what's almost purely a syntax debate. I like different syntax for different compiler behaviors. There are negatives to this specific syntax that was used. There are some benefits to the syntax that was used. In the end, us caring so much about these things is why the LLMs are going to win and just replace all of us, because we're too busy fighting about a magic string versus a magic wrapper. And I really hate that, because normally, like, I'm pretty strict where if somebody I consider smarter and deeper in the space than me, like a Tanner Lindsley or a Naman, if either of them disagree with me, I usually just side with them and shut up. and we're going at it over fucking syntax. I'm just going to play with it. Curious how you guys feel. Please be civil in the comments. I will be aggressive hiding people who are being annoying in the comments on this one, but if you actually are taking part in the discourse, which honestly, my chat's been pretty good about this overall, hopefully we'll have a productive discussion. I knew I should have built something with this before talking about it. I got nothing else. Please be kind in the comments. Until next time, peace nerds.